The Appalachian Mountains have always had a way of holding secrets, from forgotten hollers where few outsiders have ever stepped foot, to ridgelines where even seasoned hunters refuse to linger after dark. The land carries whispers older than memory. One of those whispers belongs to a man named Jared, who shared what happened to him during a hunting trip outside Clay County, Kentucky. He swore it was the last time he ever went into the woods alone, and when you hear what happened, you might understand why. Jared was 33 when it happened. He had grown up in Appalachia, raised by his grandfather, who taught him how to hunt, track, and survive in the backcountry. He considered himself experienced, even comfortable in the woods on this particular October. The air was sharp with the bite of autumn, the leaves burning red and orange across the hillsides. Jared set out for a solo hunt, hoping to bag a buck before the season turned too cold. He carried his rifle, a pack with the essentials, and the quiet confidence of someone who thought he knew the land. He parked his truck off a dirt service road and followed an old logging path until it split into animal trails. He hiked several miles in, eventually reaching a ridge where the land fell steeply into a hollow below. From up there, he could see the patchwork of ridges and valleys, fading into haze. But what caught his attention wasn't the view. It was the sound, or more accurately, the lack of it. He realized after a moment that the forest had gone completely silent. Not a crow, not a squirrel scurrying in the leaves, not even the whisper of wind in the trees. It was as if the world had paused. Jared stopped walking, his boots crunching in the leaf litter the only sound. He had heard of hunters talk about this before, the so-called dead hush that sometimes came before spotting game. He thought maybe a deer was near. He crouched low, steadying his breath, waiting, but then he heard it. A whistle. At first he thought it was a bird, maybe a warbler or some stray sound carried by distance, but the pitch was too steady, too deliberate. It wasn't a melody, just two short notes, and they came from the hollow below him. Jared frowned, uneasy. He thought maybe it was another hunter, though he had never known anyone to use a whistle to signal in those woods. He waited, listening, then it came again. Two short whistles, answered this time by two more from a different direction. The sound bounced across the ridges, one after the other, almost like a signal being passed. Jared's skin prickled. He wasn't sure why, but the hair on the back of his neck rose. He had grown up around hunters, trappers, loggers, men who worked the mountains. None of them made calls like that. None of them needed to. He decided to move on, shaking it off as maybe kids messing around or someone using an old signal. He pushed down the ridge into the hollow. The air there felt cooler, heavier. Shafts of sunlight broke through the canopy, painting the ground in stripes of gold and shadow. He followed deer sign deeper in, but he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every step seemed too loud, his breathing too harsh. He was halfway across the hollow when the smell hit him. Not the smell of a dead animal exactly, but something fouler, sharper, almost chemical. He gagged, pulling his shirt collar over his nose. He looked around, searching for the source, but saw nothing. That was when the whistle came again. This time only a few yards behind him. Jared spun, rifle raised, but the woods were empty. His heart hammered. Whoever was making the sound was close, too close. He backed away slowly, scanning the trees. "Who's out there?" he called, his voice breaking the stillness. Silence. Then from his left the two-note whistle sounded again, and from his right the same. Something was circling him. Jared's instincts screamed at him to leave. He turned and pushed hard through the brush, heading back the way he thought he had come. But the land seemed different now. Trails twisted in ways he didn't recognize. Hollows dipped where he swore the ground had been level before. It was as if the forest itself had shifted while he wasn't looking. The whistling followed. Always two short notes, sometimes far off, sometimes so close he could swear it was just behind the next tree. No matter how fast he moved, the sound paced him. He stumbled, sweat pouring down his back despite the chill air. His rifle clutched so tightly his knuckles ached. When he finally crested a rise, breath ragged, he froze. Below him, in a shallow dip in the ground, were three figures. They stood perfectly still, half hidden in the shadows of the trees. Each one tall, lean, their clothing indistinct, blending into the bark and leaves. But what struck Jared wasn't their stillness. It was their faces, or rather, the lack of them. Where features should have been, there were only smooth, pale ovals like masks without detail. One of the figures lifted its head slightly, and then, from the blank space where a mouth should be, came the whistle. 2 short notes. Jared bolted. He didn't care where he was running anymore, only that he had to put distance between himself and those things. He crashed through brush, tore through brambles, scraped his legs raw against stone and thorns. The whistles chased him, echoing through the trees, closing in from every side. At last, he saw the faint gleam of metal. His truck parked at the service road. Relief surged through him, giving his legs strength. He burst from the tree line, fumbling his keys, throwing himself into the cab as he slammed the door shut. A final whistle pierced the air, so close it felt like it came from just outside the glass. 2 short notes. He gunned the engine and tore out of there, gravel spitting beneath his tires. He didn't stop until he was miles down the road. The mountains shrinking in his rear view. Jared never hunted alone again. In fact, he told me later he sold his rifle not long after. "Those weren't people," he said, his voice low, haunted. "I don't know what they were, but I know they wanted me to follow, and if I had, I don't think I'd be here." Locals in Clay County still whisper about strange whistles in the hollows. Some say it's just wind playing tricks. Others say it's the whistlers, old spirits that mimic sounds to lure the living off the path. Jared doesn't argue. He just shakes his head, his eyes far away, because he knows better than anyone. When the forest falls silent and the whistles start, it's already too late. They say there are parts of the Blue Ridge where the land remembers what people would rather forget. A miner's hollow, long abandoned, lies tucked between 2 ridges near Wise County. Virginia, most maps do not mark it anymore. The shafts have collapsed, the roads are overgrown, and the only signs of life are the rusting remains of carts and tracks slowly sinking into the soil. But one man swears he stumbled into that hollow while out foraging ginseng, and what he found there changed him forever. The man's name was Lyle, a quiet type who preferred the company of the woods to the chatter of town. He'd been harvesting ginseng since he was a boy, taught by his father how to spot the 3-pronged leaves in shaded soil and how to dig without damaging the root. On this particular late summer day, he wandered further than usual. His pack growing heavier with each find, the sun slipped lower behind the ridges, shadows stretching long across the slopes, and he realized he had drifted into unfamiliar ground. Still, he pressed on. That was when he noticed the silence, a thick, heavy kind that pressed against his ears until he thought he could hear his own blood. Even the cicadas had gone still. He paused, uneasy. Then up ahead he saw the hollow, a depression in the hillside where black rock jutted like broken teeth, and across that hollow lay the remnants of an old mining camp. He could see the skeletal frame of a collapsed shack, a rusted pulley system sagging over a shaft sealed with timbers and piles of stone too square, too neat to be natural. Curiosity tugged at him. He had heard old-timers mention mining camps out this way, places swallowed by accidents, cave-ins, or worse, places people didn't like to talk about. He should have turned back, but instead, he stepped into the hollow. The air grew damp, clinging to his skin. A sour stench drifted up from the earth, as if the ground itself had soured. He tried not to breathe too deeply as he crossed to the collapsed shack. Inside, the beams had fallen into a tangled mess, and rats scurried in the dark. But on one wall, half buried by dirt and debris, something caught his eye, markings carved into the wood. He brushed the soil away with trembling fingers. Words emerged, gouged deep into the timber with something sharp. "Do not listen." His heart thudded. He leaned closer, seeing more scratched beneath in uneven strokes. "It knows your name." The hairs on his arms rose. Suddenly, from the direction of the shaft, he heard it. A sound so faint he thought at first it was the wind. "But the wind does not call your name, Lyle." He froze. The voice was soft. Dragging, almost wet, he spun toward the shaft, staring into the black maw, sealed with rotting beams. Nothing moved. He told himself it was a trick, an echo in his head. The kind of thing silence can do to a man. But then it came again. "Lyle, come down." The voice slithered into his bones. His body screamed at him to leave, but his feet felt heavy. Drawn toward the collapsed shaft, he stumbled forward before catching himself. digging his nails into his palms until the sting cut through the fog, clouding his thoughts. He turned, ready to bolt, when he saw them figures. At first, he thought they were shadows cast by the broken timbers, but they moved, thin, angular shapes peeling themselves from the dark. Their limbs bent wrong, elbows jutting too far, legs too long. He couldn't see their faces, only the impression of hollows where eyes should be, and mouths that never quite closed. One of them tilted its head, and though the movement made no sound, the shaft echoed with whispers. "Do not listen. Come down. Stay." Voices overlapping, pulling, pressing into his skull until he thought it would split. Lyle staggered backward, clutching his ears, but the words burrowed inside like worms. His vision blurred. He stumbled, nearly falling into the hollow ground. Somehow he forced himself away, half blind with panic. Clawing at branches as he scrambled up the ridge, the whispers chased him, rising and falling like the breath of the mountain itself. By the time he burst into familiar woods again, the voices had gone. The air was full of the usual night sounds. As if nothing had happened, he collapsed, shaking, dirt streaking his face, sweat freezing against his skin. When he finally made it home, he burned his ginseng roots in the stove. Every last one. He never went back to that hollow. Never foraged again, he warned others too, though most laughed it off. They said Lyle had breathed bad air from a mine vent, that he'd hallucinated. He stopped arguing after a while, stopped telling the story altogether. But his hands never stopped trembling, not completely, and when someone asked him once why he avoided those ridges, he whispered, "Because it knows my name." And in Appalachia, when something old and buried calls you by name, you do not answer. There is a stretch of wilderness in eastern Kentucky where the ridgelines knot together so tightly that even seasoned hunters lose their bearings. Locals call it black laurel because of the dense thickets that choke the slopes, growing so thick and tangled you cannot see more than a few feet ahead. The older generations warn people not to linger there after dark, and if you ask them why, they will shake their heads, mutter something about things best left alone, and change the subject. But curiosity is stronger than fear for some, and one fall evening, a pair of cousins named Derek and Shane decided they would camp near Black Laurel despite the warnings. Both were in their 20s, restless, and more interested in proving they were tougher than their elders' old mountain tales. They packed light, just bedrolls, some canned food, and a hunting rifle Derek insisted on carrying, though neither of them planned to shoot anything. The first day passed without incident. They hiked deep into the ridges, weaving through groves of poplar and oak, the forest glowing with autumn fire. They laughed at how quiet it was, joked about the stories of people disappearing, and by late afternoon, they found a small clearing surrounded by laurel thickets. The place felt hidden, sheltered, and Derek said it was perfect for camp. As night fell, the air cooled sharply, and a heavy mist crept down the slopes. They built a fire, cooked beans, and passed a flask between them. By midnight, they lay back on their bedrolls, staring at the stars peeking through the drifting fog. The forest around them hummed with the usual sounds. Crickets, the occasional screech of an owl, the rustle of leaves. Then it stopped. It was not gradual. The sounds cut off all at once. As if someone had snuffed them out, Derek sat up, his drunken smile fading. Shane whispered, "Do you hear that?" But there was nothing to hear, nothing at all. The silence pressed down like a weight, making their ears ring. Then came the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving through the laurel thickets around their camp. Branches snapped softly, leaves rustled, but the fog was so thick now, they could not see more than a few yards beyond the firelight. Shane grabbed Derek's rifle, his hands trembling. Derek hissed at him to be careful, but his own voice wavered. The footsteps circled them, closer, then further away, then closer again, like someone, or something, was pacing just out of sight. Deciding whether to come closer. "Who's out there?" Derek shouted into the mist. His words fell flat, swallowed instantly. No echo, no answer. Shane raised the rifle, aiming blindly. "Maybe it's a bear," he whispered. But the footsteps were too measured, too heavy, too purposeful. Bears do not walk like that. Then a shape appeared. At the edge of the firelight, just within the fog, stood a figure. Tall, thin, its shoulders hunched. Derek squinted, trying to make out a face, but the mist clung to it like a veil. The only thing clear was its height. far taller than any man should be, with limbs too long, fingers dangling past its knees. Shane swore under his breath, aiming the rifle. "Don't!" Derek hissed, grabbing his arm, but Shane's hands shook, and the barrel wavered. The figure did not move. It just stood there watching. The cousins could feel its gaze, even without seeing eyes. Seconds stretched into minutes, their fire crackling loud in the silence. Then, in a voice that did not sound human, it spoke. "You should not be here." The words were deep, distorted, like rocks grinding together. And yet they were clear, as if whispered right into their ears. Shane dropped the rifle in shock. The figure tilted its head unnaturally, then began to move, not walking, not stepping, but gliding through the fog until it melted back into the trees. The footsteps resumed, circling once more. This time, there were more than one, 2 sets, 3, moving in different directions, surrounding them. The cousins panicked. Derek kicked dirt onto the fire, snatched up their packs, and shoved Shane toward the slope. "Go!" he hissed. They crashed through the thickets, branches tearing at their clothes, lungs burning with cold air. Behind them, the footsteps followed. Slow, steady, never rushing, but always close enough to hear. They stumbled downhill, hearts pounding, but the fog thickened until they could barely see their own hands. The forest twisted strangely, paths looping back, familiar trees appearing again and again. No matter which way they ran, they ended up in the same clearing, the dead fire smoldering at their feet. The figures were waiting, this time more of them. Shapes in the mist, tall and hunched, surrounding the clearing in a silent circle. Derek screamed and swung his pack at one of them, but it passed through empty air. Shane collapsed to his knees, sobbing, begging for it to stop. One of the figures bent low, its face finally breaking through the veil of fog. Derek wished he had never seen it. Its skin was gray, stretched too tight. Its eyes empty sockets leaking blackness, its mouth impossibly wide, opening and closing like it was trying to form words. "You should not be here," it rasped again. And then they all spoke in unison, a dozen voices layered, echoing in the cousins' skulls. "You should not be here." The next thing Derek remembered was waking up at dawn, lying in the same clearing. The fire was out, their belongings scattered. Shane lay beside him, pale, lips cracked, staring blankly at the sky. When Derek shook him, he did not respond. His pulse was steady, but his mind was gone. Shane never spoke again. Doctors said it was catatonia, maybe trauma, maybe something in the air. But Derek knew the truth. He left the mountains, moved as far from Black Laurel as he could, and never returned. When asked about that night, he would say only one thing: "They told us we should not be there." And they were right. The ridges still hide Black Laurel. Hikers still disappear near it. Some are found days later, wandering without memory. Others are never found at all, and every so often, when the fog rolls heavy through the hollows, locals swear they hear it. A chorus of voices whispering from the trees, "You should not be here." On the Tennessee side of the Blue Ridge, tucked deep between ridges where cell service cuts out and the roads crumble into dirt, sits an abandoned church. The locals call it Hollow Pines Chapel, though no one has worshipped there in decades. Its windows are shattered, its steeple leans dangerously, and vines coil up the clapboard walls. Most folks steer clear of it, saying strange things linger inside. But one autumn night, a young woman named Claire found herself drawn there by accident. And what happened to her still unsettles everyone who hears the story. Claire had been driving home from visiting her aunt, winding down the narrow mountain roads long after dark. The fog rolled in thick, her headlights barely piercing more than a few feet ahead. She missed a turn, ended up on a road she didn't recognize. And when she tried to backtrack, her GPS froze. The night pressed heavy on her car, and every mile deeper made her feel more isolated, like the mountains were swallowing her whole. Then she saw it, through the trees. Half hidden by shadows, the silhouette of a church appeared. She slowed instinctively, the steeple looming against the foggy sky like a broken finger pointing upward. Relief flickered through her. Maybe she could find someone, a caretaker, or at least a landmark she could use to reorient herself. She pulled her car to the side of the crumbling road, grabbed her flashlight, and stepped into the damp night air. The church stood silent, its doors hanging slightly ajar. As she approached, she noticed strange carvings etched into the wood of the doorway, symbols she didn't recognize, crude shapes that made her skin crawl. Her beam of light caught the interior, dust swirling in the air, pews rotting in crooked lines. The altar collapsed, still something pulled her inside. The floor groaned beneath her boots. The silence was absolute, broken only by her own breath. She walked down the center aisle, her flashlight trembling in her hand. And that was when she saw them. Candles not lit, not new, but arranged in deliberate patterns along the floor, circles within circles, lines stretching across the boards. Some had melted into hardened pools of wax. Others looked freshly placed, their wicks trimmed. She crouched, unease prickling her neck. Someone had been here. Recently, then came the sound. At first it was faint, like wind seeping through cracks in the walls, but it grew clearer, forming into low chanting, voices overlapping, rising and falling in a rhythm that made her stomach knot. She spun toward the doors, but they slammed shut with a thunderous crack. Her flashlight flickered, the chanting grew louder. She backed toward the altar, her pulse hammering, the air turned cold, visible breath curling from her lips. Then she realized the voices were not outside the church. They were beneath her. She dropped her light toward the floorboards. Between the cracks, a glow pulsed faintly, red like embers. The chanting swelled, and she could feel vibrations through the soles of her boots, like something massive was moving underground. Her flashlight sputtered, died, plunging her into darkness. She fumbled with it, smacking the casing, when a new sound joined the chanting, the slow drag of footsteps. Inside the church, her heart seized. She swung the failing beam toward the aisle, and for a split second she saw them. Figures standing between the pews, cloaked, faceless in the shadows, their heads bowed as they chanted. But when the light flickered back, the pews were empty. Claire stumbled backward, hitting the collapsed altar. Her hand brushed against something slick, and she looked down. Her fingers were coated in dark, dried stains across the wood, blood. The chanting stopped. The silence was worse. Then, in a voice deep and guttural, filling every corner of the chapel, she heard a single word: stay. Her body locked, her muscles seizing as if invisible hands gripped her. She gasped, her chest heaving, but she couldn't move. The floorboards beneath her groaned, bulging upward, cracks splintering as if something below was pressing to break free. And then she saw it, between the boards. A hand forced its way up, long, skeletal, skin blackened and stretched tight. Nails jagged like claws. Another hand followed. Then the beginning of a face, eyeless, mouth yawning wide, a sound like endless breath pouring out. She screamed, the sound ripping from her throat, and somehow the force holding her broke. She bolted for the doors, slamming her shoulder into them until they burst open. She tore through the fog toward her car, not daring to look back. Behind her, the chanting resumed, louder, furious, echoing through the trees. She made it to her car, fumbling with the keys, sobbing as the engine roared to life. Her headlights illuminated the chapel one last time. The windows blazed with red light, shapes moving frantically behind them. Pressing against the glass, she peeled away, gravel spitting from her tires, the road twisting as she sped back the way she had come. When she finally reached a familiar road, her GPS blinked back to life as if nothing had happened. She didn't stop driving until she was home, shaking so hard she could barely turn the key in her door. Claire never spoke of the church to most people, but in hushed whispers, she told her closest friends that something still lingers there, waiting. And she begged them never to drive those roads at night, never to go near Hollow Pines Chapel, because whatever stirs beneath its floorboards. Once out, and in the Appalachians, when something tells you to stay, you run. There is a place high in the Blue Ridge where the tree line thins, and the ridges dip into a hollow so deep, locals call it the Pit. Maps barely mark it, and few admit to knowing the way, but hikers whisper about it in bars and gas stations. A stretch of woods where compasses spin, and no bird sings. Some say it is a collapsed mine shaft that poisons the ground. Others say it is something older, a wound in the land. It was curiosity that led Tyler there, though he would later call it the worst mistake of his life. Tyler had grown up on the edge of those mountains. Always hearing stories about the Pit as a boy, he would test his bravery, walking as far as the tree line before bolting back home, laughing with the nervous energy only kids know. But at 26, a veteran and an avid outdoorsman, He thought he was immune to old mountain ghost stories. When two of his friends from college came to visit that fall, he decided to show them the place, to prove there was nothing waiting in those hills except silence. They set out on a cool October morning, backpacks stuffed, thermoses of coffee in hand. The trail wound upward, golden leaves crunching underfoot, the air crisp with the smell of pine. For hours they joked, swapping stories from their lives in the city. But the higher they climbed, the quieter it grew. By mid-afternoon, Tyler noticed the forest had gone still. No birds, no rustle of squirrels in the leaves, just the steady crunch of their boots and the whistle of wind through bare branches. His friends noticed it too, their laughter faltering. When they crested the ridge, the world seemed to tilt. Before them stretched a hollow, wide and deep, the trees thinning into blackened stumps, the soil grey and cracked like old ash. The air smelled faintly of sulphur. Their compasses spun uselessly, even their phones, which had clung to weak signals higher up, now flashed no service. Tyler forced a laugh. See? Just some bad land, probably where a mine collapsed years ago. But as they descended into the hollow, that confidence wavered. The ground felt soft, spongy, as though something beneath it shifted with their weight. Their footsteps echoed unnaturally. The sound swallowed and then returned in distorted fragments. And then they began to find things. First, an old lantern, its glass shattered, metal rusted, lying half buried in the dirt. Then a boot, cracked leather stiff with age, laces missing. Farther along, a length of rope stretched between two stumps. The rope frayed as though clawed apart. One of his friends, Mark, muttered, "We should head back," but Tyler shook his head, though unease coiled in his gut. "We came this far. Let's at least see the center." At the bottom of the hollow, the ground dipped into a wide crater, and there, standing impossibly upright, was a door, not a cabin, not a ruin, just a door frame. Weathered wood warped with time, a rusted handle gleaming faintly in the weak light. It stood alone, anchored in the earth with no walls, no hinges visible. The three men froze. "Who the hell put this here?" whispered Jonah, the second friend. Tyler approached cautiously, each step making the air colder. When he reached it, he laid a hand on the wood. It was warm, too warm. Then came the sound. Faint at first, like breathing, then clearer. A long, steady exhale from behind the door. The men exchanged wide-eyed looks. Tyler grabbed the handle and immediately yanked his hand back with a curse. His palm throbbed as if burned. The door rattled. The ground beneath them quivered. Dust rising from the cracked earth. Jonah screamed, pointing. Shadows spilled from the base of the door, stretching like liquid across the ground, twisting into clawed shapes that reached for their legs. They bolted, scrambling up the hollow, slipping in the ash-soft soil. The shadows surged after them, stretching impossibly far. Faster than their bodies could move, Tyler glanced back only once, and wished he hadn't. The door was open, and something was stepping through. It was tall, impossibly thin, its head scraping the top of the frame, its limbs bent wrong, too many joints, its skin the color of ash. No face, just a gaping, vertical slit where its mouth should be, exhaling that endless choking breath. Tyler screamed at his friends to run faster. He shoved Jonah ahead when he stumbled, pulling Mark by the arm until they reached the ridge. Behind them, the hollow pulsed like a living wound, the door glowing with faint light, the figure moving closer. They didn't stop until they reached the safety of the tree line, lungs burning, legs shaking. When they finally dared to look back, the hollow looked normal again. The door was gone, but Tyler's hand still bore the blistered mark of the handle, an angry red welt that took weeks to fade. And even when it healed, the skin there remained different, paler, colder to the touch, as if it no longer belonged to him. Tyler never went back to the mountains. Neither did his friends, but sometimes in the dead of night, he swears he hears it again, that long, steady exhale, waiting for him to open another door. On the far side of North Carolina's Blue Ridge, tucked beyond an unmarked service road, there is a stretch of woodland the locals call the Whispering Timber. The name itself sounds almost pretty, but it carries a weight in those hills. Hunters avoid it, hikers pass it by, and old-timers say the trees themselves talk if you listen too long. Some chalk it up to wind patterns sweeping through the ridges, but those who ventured in swear the voices do not belong to the wind. Evan, a forestry student at Appalachian State, didn't believe a word of it. He had been raised in Asheville, surrounded by the mountains but always dismissive of the folklore that clung to them like moss on stone. He prided himself on science, on data, on rational explanations. So when his professor assigned him a solo mapping project in late October, and the plot of land happened to butt up against the whispering timber, he saw an opportunity to prove the locals wrong. He set out with his pack, compass, and a GPS unit, determined to finish his mapping before nightfall. The forest air was cool, the leaves a blaze of red and orange, the ground soft with fallen foliage. For hours, nothing unusual happened, he measured, noted, and charted like he'd done a dozen times before. But then the compass began to twitch. At first, it was a small deviation, the needle quivering against north. Then it spun in slow, lazy circles, refusing to settle. His GPS unit, normally reliable, flickered and froze. He frowned, tapping it, muttering about technical errors, and pressed deeper into the timber. That was when he heard it, a voice, soft, faint, almost like a child whispering his name. He stopped cold, scanning the trees. No one was there, the woods were empty, save for the distant rustle of leaves in the wind. He told himself it was auditory pareidolia, the brain inventing patterns from random noise. He shook it off and kept walking. But the whisper came again. Closer this time, Evan. His throat tightened. He swung his flashlight, though it was still daylight, the beam cutting between trunks. Nothing, his pulse hammered. But his rational mind fought back. Echoes, he reasoned. Sound carrying oddly through the valley. Still, unease clung to him like damp air. He quickened his pace, eager to finish. The further he went, the stranger it grew. The trees seemed denser, their trunks pressing close, bark twisted as though they had grown unnaturally fast. The air turned still, heavy. The whispers multiplied, not one voice now, but many, overlapping, too soft to make out words, but insistent. He tried recording it on his phone, but the playback came out as static. He turned back, deciding enough was enough, but the trail was gone. Where there had been a faint path through the undergrowth, there was now only trees. He spun in circles, panic rising. Every direction looked the same. He marked his location on the GPS, but the screen glitched, his marker blinking in and out. The whispers grew louder, some sounded right behind him. Others, far off, he caught fragments now, broken syllables that twisted his name into something sharp. Wrong. His flashlight beam jittered as his hands shook. Then he saw it between the trees, just far enough to blur at the edges of vision. Stood a figure, pale, thin, its body crooked, its head cocked unnaturally to the side. No eyes, no mouth, just smooth skin where a face should be. He froze, terror locking his legs. The whispers surged, overlapping into a cacophony that filled his skull, his ears ringing with pain. The figure tilted its head farther, bones creaking like old timber bending. Evan ran, branches whipped his face, roots clawed at his boots, but he didn't care. He sprinted blindly, heart pounding, lungs burning, the whispers chasing him, laughing, taunting. Every time he dared glance back, the figure was closer. He stumbled into a clearing, gasping for air. In the center stood an ancient oak, its trunk massive, its branches spreading wide. Carved into its bark were dozens, no, hundreds of names. Some fresh, others nearly worn away with age. At the very bottom, scratched deep, was his own name. Evan staggered backward. Choking on terror, the whispers roared. The figure stepped from the tree line, stretching its hand toward him, impossibly long fingers curling. With a desperate scream, he bolted again. He doesn't remember how long he ran. He doesn't remember how he found the road. All he remembers is collapsing in the dirt as headlights appeared. A trucker slamming on his brakes, cursing as he pulled the trembling student from the roadside. Evan never finished his project. He dropped the class, dropped out of school altogether, and left the state within the month. When pressed, he only mutters one thing. The trees knew my name before I ever got there, and to this day, locals warn hikers, never speak your name aloud in the whispering timber, because once the forest learns it, it never forgets. Black Hollow is not on most maps. It sits in a low valley at the edge of the Smoky Mountains, a stretch of marshy land where fog lingers even on bright mornings. Few people live there anymore, but truckers and late-night travelers know the name. They whisper about strange lights that dance above the bogs, pulling the curious off the road and into the dark. Where not everyone comes back, Megan, a long-haul trucker from Kentucky, had heard the stories from other drivers on CB Chatter. Most dismissed them as swamp gas or locals trying to scare outsiders. Megan laughed along but kept mental notes. She was rational, tough, and not easily spooked one October evening, hauling a refrigerated load bound for Asheville. She hit the stretch near Black Hollow around 2A, and the road narrowed, fog curling along the ditches, her headlights cutting tunnels through the mist. Her cab radio crackled with static, drowning out the country station she'd been humming to. That was when she saw the first light. It flickered low, hovering over the marsh like a lantern bobbing in someone's hand. She leaned forward, squinting. It wasn't a reflection from her headlights. It glowed on its own, a pale bluish-white pulsing faintly. Probably swamp gas, she muttered, but her hands tightened on the wheel. Then a second light appeared, then a third. They drifted across the hollow, weaving like fireflies too big to be real. Her CB hissed alive with faint chatter. She reached for the mic, thinking another trucker was close. But the words were garbled, distorted. Her name slipped through just once. Spoken in a voice she didn't recognize. Megan. She froze, mic in hand. The lights bobbed closer. As if drawn to her truck, she pressed harder on the accelerator. The engine groaning, the lights kept pace. Gliding smoothly through the fog, her GPS went blank. The road ahead stretched endlessly. Mile markers missing, signs gone. Panic flared in her chest. She'd driven this route dozens of times. She knew where she was supposed to be. But the highway felt wrong, stretched out, like she was moving in circles. The light suddenly darted across the road. She slammed the brakes, tires screeching, cargo lurching through the windshield. The glow washed her cab in ghostly blue. Shapes moved inside the light. Not people, not quite tall. Thin figures flickered within, shifting like shadows underwater. No faces, just outlines that bent and twisted with each pulse. Her radio screamed with static. The voice came again, louder, dragging her name, Megan. Come down. Against her will, she felt her hand reach for the door handle. Her body was heavy, sluggish, as though the truck's cab had filled with water. Her eyes locked on the glowing figures. Hypnotized, she wanted, no, needed to step out. She fought it, gritting her teeth, slamming her hand against the steering wheel to snap herself back. No! She yelled, voice shaking. The spell broke. She jammed the truck into gear and floored it. The rig roared forward, her trailer rattling. Fog whipping past in torn veils, the lights followed, skimming the treetops, flashing brighter. Her mirrors showed them closing in, almost brushing her trailer. Then, without warning, they blinked out, gone. Her GPS flickered back to life. The mile markers reappeared. She was less than 5 miles from the state line. She drove the rest of the night with her hands locked white knuckle on the wheel, refusing to stop until the sun rose. When she reached a rest area, she stumbled out, shaking. Her radio was dead. Her CB fried. Every electronic in her cab, including her dash cam, had shut off completely. Other drivers later told her she looked pale, drained, her eyes unfocused. She swore she'd never drive that stretch again. And she hasn't, to this day. When truckers swap stories on the CB, Megan keeps quiet, but she always listens. And whenever someone laughs off the Black Hollow lights, she grips the wheel a little tighter and whispers to herself, "They call you by name." Story. Raven's Gap is a jagged cut between two ridges deep in the Blue Ridge Mountains. The locals say the name comes not from the flocks of blackbirds that circle there, but from the sounds that echo through the pass on certain nights. Screams, they whisper, not carried from farms or travelers, but rising from deep underground. Elliot was not the type to be scared by stories. He was a geology grad student at Appalachian State, obsessed with caves, mineral veins, and the secret systems that stretched beneath the mountains. When he heard about Raven's Gap, he wasn't thinking about ghosts. He was thinking about unmapped caverns on a chilly November afternoon. He packed his climbing gear, helmet lamp, and recorder. His plan was to hike the narrow trail into the gap, camp overnight, and capture audio samples of the rumored noises. He told his advisor it was for seismic research, but in truth, he wanted bragging rights. The hike in was quiet, save for the crunch of frost underfoot and the whisper of wind through bare trees. The gap itself was unsettling, a narrow throat of stone walls that rose on either side. Sunlight barely touched the bottom. Shadows clung like ink. Elliot pitched a small tent near the center, his recorder perched on a tripod. He made notes about rock formations, joking into the mic about waiting for the ghosts to show. The first few hours passed uneventfully. Night fell fast, smothering the gap in black. Elliot sat by his camp stove, eating freeze-dried stew. When he heard it, a low moan. It wasn't the wind. It had depth, almost human, vibrating against the stone. He froze, spoon halfway to his mouth. The sound deepened, stretching into a wail that rose, broke, and twisted into what could only be described as a scream. He scrambled for his recorder, checking levels. The noise echoed from everywhere. Impossible to pinpoint, his heart hammered. But his mind clung to logic. Air movement, he muttered. Cavern resonance, then another scream joined the first. Higher pitched, desperate, Elliot stood, lamp cutting across jagged rock. "Hello?" he called, voice cracking. The cries overlapped, dozens of them now. Men and women, old and young, all rising in a hideous chorus. His lamp flickered. He cursed, tapping it. The light steadied, but shadows writhed along the stone like living things. Something moved near the base of the gap, not an animal. Too tall, too stiff. A shape stepped out from the wall itself, as if peeling free of the rock. Its body was narrow, skeletal, skin pale and stretched. The scream tore from its mouth, jaw unhinged, far wider than human. Elliot staggered back, tripping over his stove. His tent collapsed in a mess of nylon. The figure kept coming, dragging limbs that bent wrong, shrieking with every step. Then another form followed, then another, dozens of them, spilling from the walls, from the ground, all pale, all screaming in different tones. Weaving a chorus of agony, Elliot bolted for the trail. His recorder clattered to the ground. Still blinking red, the path twisted upward. But the screams chased him, echoing inside his skull. He didn't dare look back. Halfway up the ridge, his lamp died. Darkness swallowed him whole. He ran blind, branches whipping his face, stones sliding underfoot. The shrieks rose higher. Closer, surrounding him, he stumbled, rolled hard, the breath knocked out of him. When he lifted his head, he realized he wasn't on the trail anymore. He was deeper in. The gap seemed endless. Walls loomed on all sides. He spun, disoriented, hearing screams from below, from above, from inside the stone. And then silence. His ears rang. His breath came ragged. The world around him stilled. He heard a whisper behind him. "Stay." Hands like bone clamped his shoulders. Hot breath seared his neck. He screamed, tearing free, sprinting wildly until light appeared ahead. He burst from the gap, collapsing on the trail, sobbing by dawn. He made it back to his car, gear abandoned. His recorder was found weeks later by hikers. The file was intact. On playback, it captured hours of silence, until midnight. Then the screaming began. It went on for nearly 30 minutes. Overlapping voices, inhuman yet all too human. The university dismissed it as fabrication. Elliot never went back. He left his program, refusing to talk about that night. But sometimes when he sleeps, his girlfriend says he bolts upright, mouth open in a silent scream. And when she touches him awake, his skin feels cold, as if he's just stepped out of stone. The deep woods around Clay County, Kentucky are thick with pine. The trees grow so close together that even at midday, the forest floor lies in shadow. Hunters and hikers talk about getting turned around there, losing their bearings, sometimes for hours. But that is not the only thing they talk about. They talk about the whistler. Locals say that if you hear whistling in those woods, you must never whistle back, because it is not a person who answers. Landon had grown up with those stories. His grandfather told them around campfires, swearing they were true. But Landon was a skeptic. He was 23, a forestry student, practical and grounded. When his cousin Caleb suggested a weekend camping trip in the Clay County woods, Landon didn't hesitate. He was eager to prove the old tales were nothing but superstition. They set out on a Friday afternoon, carrying packs heavy with supplies. Caleb was more cautious, muttering about keeping ears open once they reached the pines. Landon laughed, brushing it off. "If I hear a whistle, I'll whistle back just to prove it's nothing." The forest swallowed them quickly. Trails narrowed, then vanished. Pines rose in endless columns, their needles muting every sound. By nightfall, they had pitched camp near a small clearing, a circle of damp earth surrounded by towering trees. The night was still, too still. No crickets, no owls, only the soft drip of condensation from branches. As they sat by the fire eating jerky, Caleb froze. "Listen," he whispered. A faint sound drifted through the pines. A whistle, 3 notes, slow, deliberate. Landon smirked. Could be another camper, but the woods were empty. They hadn't seen a soul for miles. Caleb shook his head, eyes wide. "Don't answer it." Landon, emboldened by stubborn pride, puckered his lips and whistled back. 3 notes mimicking exactly. The forest seemed to tense, then the reply came. The same 3 notes, closer this time. Caleb cursed under his breath, tossing dirt on the fire. "You idiot!" The whistling continued back and forth each time Landon answered. The response came faster, sharper, moving nearer. It wasn't just sound, it carried weight, pressing on their chests, vibrating through the ground. Finally, Caleb grabbed Landon's arm. "Stop now," but it was too late. The next whistle erupted right behind them. They spun. No one stood there. Just trees, endless trees. Then came another whistle. To the left, then to the right. The sound circled, dizzying, impossible. Landon's bravado cracked. "It's someone messing with us," he stammered. Though his voice shook, Caleb yanked him toward the tent. "We're leaving at first light," but sleep never came. The whistles kept up all night, weaving patterns. Sometimes shrill, sometimes low. Landon swore he heard breathing outside the tent. Soft footsteps circling. At one point the zipper twitched. As though fingers toyed with it, dawn finally arrived. Pale and weak through the pines. They packed fast, barely speaking as they moved. Landon noticed something in the dirt near their fire pit. Prints, not boot tracks, not animal, long, narrow impressions, almost like bare feet, except each foot had only 3 toes. They pushed harder through the forest. But the whistling followed, sometimes far, sometimes near. Always echoing between the trees, Landon tried ignoring it. But the sound burrowed under his skin, needling his nerves. He began to whistle back again without meaning to, as though compelled. Caleb slapped him across the face at one point just to snap him out of it. Hours passed, the woods unending. Landon checked his compass. It spun wildly, useless. Every path looked the same. The pines stretched on forever by late afternoon. Caleb spotted something ahead, a shape hanging from a tree. They approached cautiously. It was a bundle of sticks lashed together with twine. Forming a crude figure, hung from its neck was a strip of cloth, weathered but unmistakable, a piece of flannel, like the shirt Landon's grandfather used to wear. The whistle came again right above them. They looked up. A figure crouched in the branches, not human. Its limbs were too long. Its face featureless, smooth as bark. It tilted its head. And from the slit where a mouth should have been, a whistle poured out, the same 3 notes Landon screamed. Caleb fired a flare gun, the burst of red light scorching the air. The figure recoiled, hissing, scrambling higher into the pines before vanishing. They ran, the whistles followed. Higher now, frantic. Branches snapped overhead. Shapes darted between trees, glimpses of pale skin. Endless limbs. Landon stumbled, nearly collapsing. But Caleb dragged him forward until at last they burst from the pines onto an old logging road. Silence. The forest behind them was still. They staggered down the road until they found a ranger station. The officer on duty looked them over. Listening as they babbled their story, his face stayed calm. But when Caleb mentioned the whistling, the ranger's eyes darkened. "You boys are lucky," he said quietly. "Most who answer never make it back." Landon tried to laugh, but the sound caught in his throat. Because even now, in the back of his mind, he swore he could still hear it. 3 notes, slow, patient, calling him back into the pines. Story 10. The abandoned coal mines of West Virginia have their own kind of silence. Not the peaceful hush of a forest, but a heavy, suffocating stillness. Like the earth itself is holding its breath. Locals say you can still hear the miners down there. Boots striking stone, picks clanging, voices echoing in the dark. Ethan never believed the old stories. He was a freelance photographer, chasing forgotten places, and the mines were perfect. Rusting carts, collapsed tunnels, the ghosts of industry. One October, he set out with his friend Mariah to capture the ruins outside a town called Elkins. The mine entrance gaped at the base of a hill, half choked with weeds and boards. A rusted "Keep Out" sign dangled by a single nail. Mariah hesitated. "Maybe we should not." Ethan grinned. "Come on. This is exactly what people love to see. Creepy, forbidden, perfect." They ducked inside. Cold air rolled out, damp and metallic, smelling of rust and rot. Their flashlights cut narrow beams through the black. The tunnels stretched endlessly. Timber beams sagging, water dripping from stone. Graffiti covered the walls, names, dates, crude drawings but deeper in. The markings changed, strange symbols, circles with slashes. Crude figures scratched into the stone. Mariah frowned. These don't look like kids messing around. They pressed on. Ethan snapped photo after photo, his flash momentarily illuminating the cavernous dark. Every time, shadows leapt across the walls. Twisted and elongated, then came the sound, a faint tapping. Deep in the tunnel ahead, tap, tap, tap. Ethan froze. Hear that? Mariah clutched his arm. Could be water, but the taps were rhythmic, deliberate, like knuckles rapping on stone. They followed the sound, drawn deeper. The tunnel sloped downward, the air thick with coal dust. The tapping grew louder, joined by faint whispers that slid along the rock. Words too soft to catch, but undeniably voices. Mariah's breath quickened. We should go. Ethan hesitated. His camera clicked. Just one more shot, he raised it, and froze. Through the lens at the far end of the tunnel, a figure stood, a miner bent and twisted, helmet lamp glowing faintly, but its face was wrong, too long. The mouth stretched ear to ear, grinning impossibly wide. Ethan lowered the camera. The tunnel was empty. Mariah tugged him. Ethan, please. They turned to leave, but the tunnel behind them had changed, where they had walked minutes before. The beams had collapsed. The way was blocked. Panic rose. They backtracked. Plunging deeper into the mine, the tapping followed. Faster now. Tap, tap, tap. Their lights caught something ahead. Not stone, something carved. A chamber opened, its walls etched with the same strange symbols. In the center stood a pit, yawning black, deeper than their beams could reach. From the pit came the whispers, louder now, urgent, begging. Mariah covered her ears. Make it stop. Ethan edged closer. His light swept the rim and caught movement fingers, dozens of pale, skeletal hands clinging to the edge. Pulling at the stone, faces emerged, hollow-eyed, mouths gaping in silent screams, and behind them, rising from the dark, came something larger, a shape vast and formless, coal-black but glistening, its body writhing like smoke and flesh all at once. The tapping boomed now, reverberating through the chamber like a heartbeat. The thing climbed. Ethan and Mariah bolted. They didn't care where they went, only away. The tunnels twisted, warped, never leading the same way twice. Sometimes they looped back to the pit. No matter how far they ran, sometimes the whispers guided them, voices calling their names, urging them to follow. At one point, Mariah tripped. Ethan pulled her up, but not before her flashlight beam swept the wall and revealed dozens of miners' helmets mounted into the rock. Fused with stone, empty sockets where eyes should have been. They ran until their lungs burned, then miraculously, light appeared ahead, a faint glow. They stumbled toward it. Emerging into the night through a different opening, they collapsed on the hillside, gasping. The mine mouth yawned behind them, silent, still. Ethan lifted his camera with shaking hands. The last photo he'd taken in the chamber had burned onto the screen. Not the pit, not the hands. It showed him and Mariah standing side by side, but someone else was with them. A miner, grinning wide, his helmet lamp glowing.